Hi, welcome Ruth Paxton. She's the director of A Banquet that's just had its world premiere here at the Toronto International Film Festival 2021. I'm Diana Sanchez. I'm the Senior Director of Film, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you back to Tiff. I know you were here with a talent lab years ago, and now you're here with your debut. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
It's a very different festival, as you know, and yeah, we're thrilled that we're able to have your debut feature, A Banquet. And I have a lot of questions. I am so curious if you don't mind telling us like the inspiration for the story, because it's a very unique dystopian kind of worldview, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Of course, I should say that I'm not the writer of this. So it was written by a brilliant screenwriter called Justin Bull, who's based in Concord in Boston. And that's where the story was originally set. In the early stages of production, we decided to relocate it to the UK for loads of different reasons. But from the outset, it was about a very middle-class Bostonian kind of suburban family. And I think that what Justin was interested in writing about, and what I too, kind of latched onto with the themes, was the idea of men controlling women's bodies. And I think, he'd become very curious about fasting girls, a kind of phenomenon of, like, I suppose, Victorian era, whereby, women would claim to have commune with God, and basically, see their bodies as in service to that kind of higher purpose, and to prove their commitment and spirituality by not eating, by refusing to eat. And I think that what it did for these women at the time was it actually gave them a voice. And that was something that Justin was really interested in, and I too kind of thought was something I hadn't thought about before. But I think also when I read the script, what I really clung to as a person who's not religious was the idea of Betsey's character believing so strongly in something that not other people can't see. So like that's there was a madness about it that I could relate to. I understood her the idea of what might happen as a result of eating something. I'm somebody who in the past has had an eating disorder, and so I understand that what starvation does. It's a certain kind of madness, and it's also, there's a real genuine belief that something bad will happen if you eat. So that kind of, for me, coming from a very atheist background, that was my route into it.
No, that's really interesting, because the way that food is shot in the film, there's a lot of care in making even like delicious things look, there have that element of grotesqueness to them. Can you talk about how you chose to film the food?
Yeah, I mean, I've made a few films where food has almost been a character, and I think there's something about the body horror and organic horror that I was sort of interested in talking about with this film. So obviously it's a horror film, it's a psychological horror film, but for me, the real horror is all stuff that's rooted in what's recognizable and what's very human. So I knew that I wanted all the monstrous things to be stuff that's domestic, stuff that's in our everyday lives. And I definitely wanted, the food to be almost pornographic in that sense. So, yes, we always knew we were going to be going really close in on the food and, really examining it. And yeah, I think, in order to, I suppose, just to encourage the thoughts of like what comes in and goes out of our bodies, and to make us think about our bodies. And definitely, like, Cronenberg's kind of, classic body horror was a huge influence for me on how I wanted to do horror, I guess, in this film.
And what goes in the film, though, it doesn't come out. I mean, she doesn't lose any weight, which is so, right. Why did you? Yeah. What was the reason behind that choice?
It's interesting because in the development process, there were versions of the script where at the end she did lose weight. She dramatically lost weight, and it was as though we saw what Holly had not been seeing all along. But I was concerned about how how to depict young women who are anorexic on screen, and do it in a way where you're not making doing it gratuitously and making a horror story out of something that's very serious. And also, I wouldn't have wanted the actress to lose weight, and so there was a lot of issues for me around the actual how we would realize that. And then I think we decided that really it was the question. We didn't want to give Holly anything to show that what Betsey was prophesizing or believing was in any way. We didn't want to give it any evidence. Basically, it had, right up to the last moment, it had to be Betsey's word only. So that's why we showed that she didn't lose weight. And I guess it's really up to the audience to decide on leaving whether or not Betsey was telling the truth or Holly was going mad, I suppose.
Right. No, it's interesting because that's a choice that also emerged from being careful with your actors, and I find that really interesting because there's a big difference if she's losing weight in the film or not, and maybe it just leads you to different conclusions, right? I think that's a really interesting.
I think the thing is that if a mother were to witness her daughter losing weight, it wouldn't matter what she said.
Yeah,
she would the thought, the image when young people and girls lose weight, it is horrific. It's shocking. I've seen the way my mother's looked at me when I lost weight. There's no way that we could keep the idea that we want Holly to have a leap of faith, that we need her to believe what her daughter is saying. That wouldn't. The minute that you saw, the evidence of weight loss, I think Holly would have buckled and taken her to hospital. She would have had her institutionalized.
No, absolutely. And just talking about how the horrors are domestic ones, the grandmother is very, very, very scary. Can you talk a little bit about, you've got these 3 generations of women, and the grandmother is just shocking.
Yeah, she's a phenomenal actress as well. Lindsay Duncan, she was exactly who we wanted, and she agreed to do it. And I was so delighted. She's also the opposite of her character. I know that's a cliche thing to say, but she was the nicest person in the world. She was great. I think the thing is that she's an example of a woman who, from a generation that maybe didn't put themselves first or their interests first or their passions first. So she's somebody for whom, being a mother wasn't necessarily the most important part of her identity. And I think that, when Holly experienced, the film suggests that Holly's had her own difficulties in the past, whether that's, with food or not is irrelevant, but she certainly had mental health issues. And the way that June's dealt with that is to have her sent away, because that's what would have been advised at the time. And so Holly's, it's, all mothers want to nurture their children, don't get me wrong, but for Holly, it's like it's a very personal thing to be a good mother, to be there for her children, and to be able to kind of give them what I suppose she didn't have. And that's why I think also she's reluctant to see Betsey go into hospital or, go away in any sense, so that she doesn't do to her what was done to her in the past.
Yeah, and right from the beginning, I mean, the father's not there. I think at the beginning, we see that I don't think it's referred to again, but we see that the father is no longer with the family. Was that like an important to start the film from that, giving that information?
Yes, I think we needed this family we needed to witness what the wound was, where it came from. And I think that, Betsey and Holly are characters who, at the beginning of the film, are both questioning what the point is. And for very different reasons. Betsey's a young woman on the cusp of, moving from high school to university, but she lives in a world where, we're very, very hyper aware of climate change, and she's conscious that, the world's dying. And so there's lots of pressure on her to make choices about college and about the future. But at the same time, what's the point? Is there a future to be in? And Holly's very much trying to hold everything together after her husband's left them by suicide. And I was very interested in weaving into the story the idea of inherited suicide. I'd read a lot about the poets Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and their children who would go on to try and commit suicide. And who actually, I think with Sylvia Plath's son, did commit suicide. And the idea that if, you know, I suppose if you do as your parents do, and if you see in a circumstance that, you know, basically I wanted to demonstrate that Jason, the father, had shown Betsey that as a way out. And so, you know, I think that's playing on Holly's mind, and that's one of the strands that you could take in how you look at Betsey, how Betsey deals with her grief. You know, is she telling the truth, or is she unwell? Is she believe what she's saying, or is she being vindictive?
Right. No, I do like how you're never quite sure. That I do find that, yeah, I think that really keeps the audience in like suspense. And you know, the way the film is shot, it's very atmospheric. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? How you created that atmosphere? There's that continual suspense throughout.
I'm quite good at doing dread. I think that's what I've got good at in making short horror films. Well, the thing is, I don't think of myself as a horror director, but I think that, you know, I'm interested in talking about psychology. And I think that the scariest parts, the scariest things I've ever experienced have been the things that I've done in my own head. They've not been monsters. They've not been, you know, I guess vampires or figures from other kind of horror genres. It's very much like, you know, the hardest stuff I've gone through is stuff my own head has done to me. And I think that's what I wanted to, you know, I wanted to create that sense of anxiety and dread throughout the film. And I didn't want the audience to ever feel safe or comfortable. But I did want it to be beautiful. And so, you know, it was a very low budget film, but the majority of the budget was concentrated on, you know, what we could do with production design to make it look as lush as possible. And the cinematographer, David Little, and I, who've been working together for over 10 years now, our focal references are always painterly. We always are, you know, that's where we start from. It's always Baroque art, classic art, Caravaggesque art, or in this case, it's a contemporary painter called Ken Curry, who's very much our kind of touchstone for the imagery. And it really is the kind of, I suppose, the traditional chiaroscura idea of things coming out the dark, things emerging from shadows, and that being what it feels like to be in one's head. That's very much an idea that I've kind of worked into most of the films I've made.
No, it is very beautiful. Like I said, the scenes of the food, I could just, it was delectable and also frightening. I love that that duality that you infuse into
I know, yeah, you're kind of gagging one. I know when the editor was cutting the scene where there's maggots, let's say,
yeah.
That he was so disgusted he couldn't eat his lunch that day. So I was like, well, that's great. That's really good. It means it's working.
Exactly. And another thing that you touched on, which I find really interesting about the film, is this anxiety about the environment. It's you infuse. It's a very, you know, domestic story, but there is a lot of you know, links to present day anxieties about the environment. You know, even like if you're looking now on Netflix or HBO, there's all these stories about UFOs and you know, communing with people on Earth. Did you guys discuss how you would include that into this very domestic story?
Yeah, it was something that Justin had firmly, you know, planted in the original draft. And it was something I wanted to hang on to. I think I'm not a parent. And I don't know lots of young people, but I can see from the outside that it must be terrifying. I remember when I was wee, I was frightened of war. I was scared that we would go to war. That was like my kind of big thing, was that, you know, my dad was going to have to go and fight in a war. And I guess now it's like, you know, kids at school are learning to be ecologically mature and you know, take care of the planet, and that's a big responsibility. So I think that was something that was really interesting to me about Betsey's generation and Betsey's character, and the fact they're doing a fundraiser at the beginning. Yeah. When the film, there was a vision for the film that might have cost more money, and that would have included maybe seeing more of how Betsey at school, and the school might have been working with the kids to think about the economy and stuff. But sorry, I just saw a message that I got distracted by. I'm very sorry, in the chat. So yeah, it was definitely a concern. I think, you know, it's not like a sort of major theme, but it's a smaller theme that's running through it, definitely. And yes, the idea that, like, you know, you could see with kids that the appeal of a restart button is something that could be, something that could appeal to a younger generation at this point.
No, absolutely. And it's important, like, to see just how these themes are permeating art at so many different levels. And it's just interesting to see within this story just how that's layered in. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, I loved how you filmed the house. Like, I felt really, disconcerted. I wasn't sure where I was. Can you talk about those choices? Yeah.
I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because when we made this film during COVID, and we came out, we shot it when coming out of the first lockdown in London. But when it came to picking the location, that was something that COVID really impacted on, because so many people, it was such a new landscape, and all the homes that might have once been available to rent for something like this, who were up for being film locations, weren't up for that. So we had very few choices. And this house wasn't really what I had envisaged at first. But when we went there, you couldn't deny that it was, architecturally fascinating. And what I liked was that the large living dining area felt like a stage. It felt like a theatrical setting, like that's where you go to put, it sort of felt Grecian to me in some way. But also it reminded me of the ice rink. So there was things about it that just spoke to us immediately. But there also was the fact that it was in a suburb, but hidden. So it was kind of its own little fortress with this big kind of Parasite-esque window onto the world in the back garden. But the main thing I liked about it was that there was so many entrances to the building, and you couldn't tell where people were coming and going from. So I really love to hear you say that. It's sort of labyrinth-like, and it meant that a film that was sort of like 80% shot in a house, and you're trying to hold an audience's attention, we had to find a location that was going to be interesting to shoot over and over and over again in different ways. And certainly the production designer was really turned on by the location too, and that's always exciting to me. So yeah, I'm just really pleased to hear you say that.
It works beautifully. It's very disconcerting. I was not sure how you did it. It's so I was like wondering, how did they manage to make it seem like you're not in the same place sometimes too? Just so interesting.
That's great.
So Ruth, thank you. We're having your film. We're less than 3 weeks away to TIFF. Really looking forward to welcoming you here at TIFF 2021 again. And I'm so happy that you're sharing your world premiere with the Toronto audience this year.
I feel very, 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 very fortunate, and I'm really pleased to be at TIFF. I'm so excited to come.